Berlin, 1943. Inside the Abwehr's Section Tirpitzufer office on Tirpitzufer Street, intelligence analysts huddled over a freshly decoded report from neutral Sweden. The document, intercepted through the commercial attaché network, contained what seemed to be absurd claims about American production. According to it, the United States was building one tank every 20 minutes. Oberst Heinrich von Lossow, chief of industrial intelligence, scoffed. 20 minutes? Ridiculous. Perhaps they count bicycles as tanks, his subordinates chuckled. But one young analyst, a mechanical engineer by training, hesitated before laughing. The numbers didn't feel like propaganda. They felt like math. The report listed factories: Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal, Ford's Willow Run, Fisher Body in Cleveland, each churning out armored hulls with assembly line precision. It claimed entire tank hulls were welded together in under 4 hours, engines installed in 2, painted and tested by nightfall. The Abwehr circulated it with the standard stamp: Feindliche Übertreibung, enemy exaggeration. Yet similar intelligence soon followed. The Japanese military attaché in Washington sent cables noting staggering output of mechanized weapons, quoting U.S. newspapers bragging that America would soon outproduce all Axis powers combined. The Reich Ministry for Armaments and War Production, led by Albert Speer, dismissed it. Impossible, he said at a conference that autumn. Our intelligence is being fed Allied propaganda to weaken morale. But by late 1943, deep in occupied France, frontline German units began encountering something that forced reconsideration: waves of Sherman tanks appearing faster than they could be destroyed. At Kursk, German officers had believed that every Panther lost was irreplaceable. By contrast, American tank crews received replacements in days. Inside Berlin, disbelief gave way to confusion. How can an enemy so inefficient produce in such volume? Speer asked his production chiefs. His team blamed exaggeration, yet Germany's own steel allocations told the truth. Even at full capacity, German heavy industry could not match more than a week of American tank output. In December 1943, the Abwehr obtained a captured issue of Life magazine from Lisbon. The feature headline read, "The Arsenal of Democracy: How America Builds a Tank Every 20 Minutes." The spread included photographs of the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan. Mile-long assembly lines, cranes moving turret rings like toys, women riveting armor plates beside conveyor belts. To Berlin, it was absurd theater. To Washington, it was fact. The American Midwest. 1942. From the air, the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant looked impossible. Nearly a mile long, its shape curved to fit a bomber assembly line that could not stop. Trains brought steel and rubber at one end. Tanks, trucks, and bombers rolled out the other. To a visitor from Berlin, it would have looked like an entire city dedicated to production. Inside, hundreds of thousands of workers labored in shifts that never ended. Men who had built Model Ts now welded armor plate. Housewives who had never touched a wrench installed transmissions. Immigrants, farmers, and engineers all worked under the same roof, building machines of war. The assembly line never slept. At its peak, a finished tank left the Detroit Arsenal every 20 minutes, and a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line every hour. In Europe, the Wehrmacht's intelligence branch began to receive reports too consistent to ignore. Swedish trade attachés described massive American ship convoys carrying tanks, trucks, and aircraft to Britain. Spanish observers confirmed docks filled with endless crates marked U.S. Army Ordnance Department. By late 1942, German panzer divisions in North Africa were already facing the results of that production. Rommel's Afrika Korps intercepted brand-new M4 Sherman tanks, landed weeks after being assembled in Michigan. Many still had factory chalk on the hulls. Back in Berlin, Albert Speer began to take the numbers seriously. He ordered a secret study comparing German and American production capacity. The results alarmed him. Even with total mobilization, the Reich could not match more than 10% of U.S. tank output. German military economists tried to rationalize it. American tanks are crude, poorly armored, wasteful. But on the battlefield, sheer numbers began to tell a different story. For every Panther that broke down from over-engineering, 5 Shermans replaced it. By 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily revealed what industrial war meant. Allied supply dumps were stacked higher than houses. "It is not an army, it is a machine," wrote one German staff officer. Berlin still labeled the tank every 20 minutes report as propaganda. Yet in the factories along the River Ruhr, workers whispered rumors that the Americans were producing machines faster than bullets could destroy them. By early 1944, the German war economy was beginning to fracture under its own weight. Allied bombers shredded rail lines and oil refineries, while Albert Speer's production miracle strained against the limits of physics. He had done the impossible, tripled output despite losing half of Germany's industrial territory. But even he knew it was a mathematical game he couldn't win. At a meeting of the Zentrale Planung Committee in January, Speer received a new report from Abwehr the Thun. It claimed that Ford's Willow Run plant had built over 8,600 bombers and that Chrysler's Detroit arsenal had produced 25,000 tanks in 3 years. Speer tapped the page with his finger and looked up. "If this is true," he said, "then industrial war is no longer war. It's arithmetic." His subordinates stayed silent. None dared mention that Speer himself had authorized a study months earlier confirming that the U.S. had outproduced the entire Axis combined in steel, fuel, and trucks by a ratio of nearly 10-to-1. Meanwhile, in Michigan, the scale of American production reached surreal proportions. Rail yards stretched for miles with freight cars full of tank hulls. At Ford's Rouge plant, molten steel poured day and night. Sparks flew like fireworks as armor plates were pressed into form. Each shift change resembled a small army moving in. Reverse, civilians marching to war with lunch pails instead of rifles. German intelligence, agents operating in South America, began forwarding photographs clipped from Time and Life magazines. They showed endless rows of tanks lined up for shipment, new planes wrapped in wax paper against corrosion, and freighters leaving New York Harbor so frequently that one could walk to Britain on their decks, as one spy reported. Berlin refused to believe it. Goebbels's propaganda ministry ridiculed the photos as doctored Hollywood trickery. Radio Berlin mocked the American worker as lazy, unskilled, and dependent on machines. But inside the Wehrmacht's operations staff, officers quietly stopped laughing. In the East, Soviet T-34s poured from the Urals faster than German panzers could be repaired. In the West, new American units kept arriving with fresh tanks whose serial numbers still smelled of paint. Speer understood what that meant. Quantity itself had become a weapon. He ordered a crash program to study Ford's methods. German engineers from Opel and Mercedes tried to replicate the moving assembly line, complete with conveyor belts and modular components. But constant bombing and labor shortages made it impossible. At Wolfsburg, the Volkswagen plant meant for civilian cars was converted to build V-1 missiles, but production never matched expectations. German industry could build precision, not volume. In a secret memorandum later recovered from Speer's archives, one line stood out in his handwriting. "They can waste what we cannot afford to save." That is the true measure of defeat. By mid-1944, Allied reconnaissance photos of Detroit revealed a new sight, a continuous rail pipeline of tanks and aircraft, stretching across the Great Lakes to ports in New York. Each tank had a tag: destination, Liverpool, Naples, Cherbourg. Every 20 minutes, a new one rolled out, precisely as German spies had once claimed. The propaganda had been truth all along. Spring 1944. The Reich Chancellery's Situation Room had become a theater of disbelief. Intelligence intercepts arriving from France and Belgium described Allied columns of armor stretching beyond the horizon. Thousands of vehicles. Everyone knew. Luftwaffe reconnaissance confirmed that the British ports were overflowing with American tanks, awaiting the coming invasion. General Alfred Jodl reviewed the reports and muttered, "They can't all be real." Yet aerial photos didn't lie. Entire tank parks in southern England gleamed under tarps, and the Allies were adding more daily. Inside the OKW War Map Room, analysts tried to calculate what one tank every 20 minutes meant in practice. The numbers seemed absurd until they multiplied it over time. 72 tanks per day, over 2,000 per month, 24,000 per year. One general stared at the figure and whispered, "That's more than our entire armored reserve." Meanwhile, in the American Midwest, those numbers weren't projections. They were schedules. At Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal, production foremen shouted above the thunder of stamping presses. Hydraulic arms riveted armor plates with the rhythm of an orchestra. Sparks rained like gold dust as welders sealed the hulls. Overhead cranes moved turrets across the plant floor in perfect synchronization. Every section of the factory had a timer on the wall, 20 minutes, the average interval between completed M4 Sherman tanks leaving the final test bay. Factory whistles signaled completion cycles. Workers cheered each new tank as it rolled past the exit line, headlights glowing. Many tanks were driven directly onto railway flat cars, already labeled for shipping to East Coast ports. In Berlin, the Abwehr's Industrial Intelligence Branch intercepted American trade journals confirming the miracle. Steel magazine boasted that Detroit alone produces more war material than the entire Axis. The report landed on Spies' desk in April. He read it silently, then folded the paper and said, "We will lose, not on the battlefield, but in the factories." To compensate, Germany turned to desperation. Hitler demanded miracle weapons, Tiger IIs, jet fighters, V rockets, machines that consumed triple the resources of conventional models. The Tiger II required 300,000 man-hours to build. An American Sherman needed less than 40,000. For every Königsteiger that rolled out of Kassel, the U.S. produced 8 Shermans. As the Allied invasion loomed, field reports confirmed what Speer already feared. Panzer divisions destroyed in Normandy were being replaced with units equipped with training tanks and obsolete Panzer IIIs. The Americans, meanwhile, replenished losses in days. Their logistics ships arrived faster than German field depots could repair. In July, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot flying over Cherbourg photographed a convoy that stretched 20 kilometers inland. He described hundreds of tanks, nose to tail, moving in a continuous stream. The intelligence summary concluded grimly. Enemy tank losses appear irrelevant to operational capacity. In the Führer bunker, Hitler rejected the report. "They lie," he insisted. "No one builds machines that fast." But by August, as the front collapsed in France, the truth became impossible to ignore. A single American factory in Michigan had produced more tanks than all of Germany's armored divisions combined. The myth of one tank every 20 minutes had become an understatement. Autumn 1944. The Reich was collapsing faster than anyone in Berlin dared to admit. The Abwehr's remaining agents in Sweden and Switzerland kept forwarding reports that no one wanted to read. Everyone confirmed the same thing. America's industrial machine was operating at a scale beyond imagination. One intercepted telegram from Stockholm, dated September 2nd, summarized it bluntly. United States output for August: 2,300 medium tanks, 7,000 aircraft, 25,000 trucks, comparable to entire Axis production in same period. Albert Speer read it in silence, then placed it into a folder labeled Feigned Production. Unverifiable claims. He knew it was true. He had seen the captured Shermans in Normandy. New, clean, factory fresh, arriving faster than German repair shops could fix their own wrecks. Inside the Reich's armaments ministry, desperation replaced denial. The Panther tank, Germany's prized design, required nearly 150,000 man-hours to assemble and weeks of machining. In the United States, Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal built an M4 Sherman in less than 25,000 hours, and it worked. German engineers obsessed over tolerances of 0.01 millimeters. Americans stamped parts to 0.5 and made them fit by force. The result was the same tank, built 10 times faster. At Opel's headquarters in Rüsselsheim, production managers gathered for what would be their last meeting. A Luftwaffe liaison arrived with a captured U.S. ordnance manual taken from France. He opened to a page showing the American supply doctrine. If it breaks, replace it. The Germans stared at it in disbelief. Replace it? With what? We have nothing to replace. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the assembly lines in Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland were accelerating, not slowing. War production had become a rhythm of civilization. Every city a cog in a massive engine. Children collected scrap metal. Women assembled ammunition belts. Engineers designed entire factories on paper in a single weekend. At Ford's Rouge River complex, furnaces belched fire 24 hours a day. The night sky glowed orange for miles. From a catwalk above the factory floor, one manager famously said, "We're not building tanks anymore. We're building time." Each tank rolling out meant hours saved on the battlefield. Hours that Germany could never recover. In occupied Europe, German units began to notice strange patterns. Every captured Sherman tank bore serial numbers only weeks old. They were so new that crews found American candy wrappers and fresh cigarette packs inside. German intelligence officers attempted to calculate the replacement rate. Their conclusion stunned the Wehrmacht High Command. The United States replaces the material losses of a panzer division every 2 days. Speer took the report directly to Hitler. The Führer dismissed it as defeatist nonsense. But in private, Speer confided to his staff, "He still thinks it's propaganda. The truth is we're already fighting ghosts. For every tank we destroy, 2 more are already at sea." By November 1944, American tank production reached its zenith. Detroit alone was producing more armored vehicles per month than the entire Axis combined. The figure the Abwehr had once laughed at, 1 tank every 20 minutes, had become a historical understatement. In a single 24-hour cycle, American factories produced more engines than Germany could deliver in a month. The industrial war was over. The battlefield just hadn't realized it yet. February 1945. The Reich's last steel mills in the Ruhr still burned, but their smoke carried the scent of defeat. Allied bombers had turned most of Germany's industrial heartland into rubble, yet even in ruins, the illusion of parity persisted. Hitler still believed the 20-minute tank claim was a psychological trick designed to demoralize his people. Albert Speer no longer argued. He'd seen too many reports, too many photographs, too many numbers that didn't lie. At a secret meeting in the underground Reich Chancellery, he presented a final briefing to the OKW staff. "Gentlemen, the Americans no longer produce weapons. They produce abundance. They do not build tanks for war. They build them to break arithmetic." In his hand was a set of Allied intelligence estimates captured at Aachen. It showed U.S. output curves for 1944 Sherman tanks, 49,234 units, trucks, and jeeps, 650,000 aircraft, 96,000 artillery pieces. 80,000. Speer stared at the figures and murmured, "No army can fight mathematics." On the other side of the Atlantic, the scale had become routine. Rail convoys left Detroit every hour, stacked with tanks bound for New York ports. Entire trains carried nothing but spare parts. Freight ships were loaded with fully fueled Shermans, pre-tested and painted for desert, forest, or snow, all built to order. In the American press, the story was no secret. Life, Newsweek, and the Saturday Evening Post ran covers proudly announcing a tank every 20 minutes, a bomber every hour. To the public, it was patriotism. To German intelligence, it sounded like sorcery. By March, Allied ground forces rolled through the Siegfried Line with an endless supply of armor. German soldiers joked bitterly, "The Americans don't have divisions, they have factories." In one intercepted letter from a panzer commander near Remagen, the writer confessed, "We destroyed 10 of their tanks and 20 return by dawn. It is like cutting grass that grows back overnight." Speer visited a Panther assembly plant near Kassel in March 1945. The workers were exhausted, tools dull, electricity failing. A foreman told him they could build only 3 tanks a week now, using scrap steel and salvaged parts. Speer nodded and said nothing. The line had stopped pretending to compete. Back in Berlin, the Abwehr's last active intelligence unit compiled its final wartime industrial report. The opening paragraph read, "Initial assessments that the United States could produce 1 tank every 20 minutes were considered Allied propaganda. This is now verified as conservative. Production efficiency exceeds all known metrics in industrial history. Even in the dying days of the war, the Allies continued to ship thousands of vehicles across the Atlantic, so many that hundreds sat unused in depots by the time the fighting ended. The United States had built more tanks than it could deploy, more planes than it could fly, and more ships than it could crew. When Allied soldiers finally crossed the Rhine, they did so in jeeps, trucks, and Shermans that had been assembled less than a month before. Every vehicle carried a silent message to the German High Command. You thought we couldn't build them this fast. In April, as Berlin fell under artillery fire, Speer dictated a note to his secretary, later found among his papers at Spandau prison. The Americans fought not with men, but with factories. Their true weapon was the conveyor belt. He was right, from the first tank rolled out in Detroit to the last column crossing the Elbe. The war's outcome had already been sealed long before the front lines knew it. The myth the Germans dismissed as propaganda, the idea of 1 tank every 20 minutes, had been the truth that buried them. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Berlin lay in ruins. The last Abwehr archives were seized by American occupation officers, and among the papers, analysts found a folder stamped Feindliche Übertreibung, enemy exaggeration. Inside were the same intercepted reports from 1942 and 1943. The ones the Reich had laughed at. Every single prediction had come true. The Americans had indeed built tanks faster than Germany could count them. They had built engines faster than Germany could fuel them. And they had built ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. At Nuremberg, Albert Speer sat before the tribunal, calm but hollow-eyed. When questioned about Germany's defeat, he didn't mention strategy or courage. He spoke instead about industry. The United States, he said, defeated us with factories, not divisions. They produced not weapons but infinity. We designed masterpieces. They designed abundance. The courtroom fell silent. The judges, most of them soldiers, understood what he meant. After the war, Allied engineers and economists examined the numbers. The findings were almost absurd in scale. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 88,000 tanks, 324,000 aircraft, 6 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. By comparison, Germany's total armored production during the entire war barely exceeded $45,000. At the height of the conflict, one American plant in Detroit built more tanks in a week than Germany did in a month. And for every tank built, there were 2 replacement engines, 3 transmissions, and a mountain of spare parts ready to follow it overseas. The legend of the 20-minute tank became more than a statistic. It became a symbol of industrial democracy defeating militarized autocracy. The Allies hadn't simply outfought the Axis, they had outbuilt them. When American GIs drove through destroyed German towns in their endless convoys of Shermans, half-tracks, and supply trucks, local civilians stared in silence. To them, it looked less like an army and more like an avalanche of steel. One captured Wehrmacht colonel later told his interrogators, "We were engineers. We believed in precision. They believed in volume. We built art. They built eternity. That eternity became the blueprint of modern warfare. Factories, not fortresses. Supply lines, not slogans." In 1951, when Ford unveiled the last remaining M4 from the Detroit Arsenal Museum, a small plaque beneath it read, "Every 20 minutes, one of these rolled out." That was the sound of victory. The myth that began as an intelligence rumor had outlived the Reich that denied it. The tank that Berlin mocked as propaganda had become a monument to a truth the world would never forget. In modern war, production is power, and disbelief is defeat. Summer 1945. In the shattered offices of the former German Armaments Ministry, Allied intelligence officers sorted through what remained of the Reich's industrial archives. Among the papers was a single yellowed dossier labeled Amerikanische Rüstungsberichte, American Armament Reports. It contained the same intelligence that had once been mocked, factory output charts, newspaper clippings, even hand-drawn maps of Detroit. Every German note scribbled in the margins told the same story. Unverifiable. Impossible. Propaganda. Now, looking back, the irony was almost cruel. What Berlin had refused to believe had crushed it. In post-war interviews, Albert Speer spoke with an honesty rare among his peers. "When the Abwehr first showed me those reports," he told Allied investigators, "I thought they were fantasies. No nation could build so fast. But I was an architect. I should have known better. The Americans built war the way we built cities." He was right. The Allied Control Council's industrial survey revealed the truth. The Detroit Arsenal had built more tanks than all of Germany's combined. Factories. Ford's Willow Run produced 1 B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at its peak. U.S. shipyards launched a Liberty ship every 4 days. The U.S. produced more trucks in 1 year than Germany managed in the entire war. Investigators realized that the U.S. didn't just scale production, it mechanized time itself, where German factories still relied on craft precision. America relied on process. Where the Reich chased quality, the Allies pursued continuity. And continuity had won. Speer would later call it the triumph of imperfection. "They built with flaws," he said, "but they built forever." The post-war U.S. economy emerged from this machine of abundance unchanged in principle. Detroit simply replaced tanks with cars, bombers with airliners, and trucks with buses. The same assembly lines that had turned out weapons now powered a global consumer empire. For Germany, the lesson became doctrine. In the 1950s, West German industry rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, using the very methods it had once dismissed as primitive. Engineers who had once designed panzers now studied conveyor systems, batch manufacturing, and modular design, all copied from the enemy propaganda they had ignored. When historians later calculated the economic weight of World War II, the results were staggering. By 1945, the United States had outproduced the Axis by a factor of 16 to 1. Its factories consumed more raw material than the rest of the world combined, and its shipyards were launching tonnage faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink it. For every hour the war continued, America's industrial base grew stronger. For Germany, every hour was exhaustion. One British observer summed it up best at the Nuremberg trials. The Germans tried to build a perfect sword. The Americans built a factory that made 1,000 swords before lunch. In the decades after the war, the legend of the 20-minute tank remained one of the most enduring symbols of industrial warfare. It was more than a statistic. It was a warning. Every generation of strategists studied it. Every economist quoted it. And every general understood what it meant. That wars are no longer won by courage or tactics, or even genius, but by production, logistics, and time. The laughter that once echoed through Berlin's intelligence rooms had faded into history, replaced by a single line inscribed on the walls of the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum. They said it was propaganda. It was the truth that ended the war.